The stifling July heat radiating off the tarmac in Saudi Arabia felt like stepping directly into an open furnace. It was July 1974, and an unmarked American jet rolled quietly to a halt under the blinding desert sun. Out stepped newly appointed U.S. Treasury Secretary William Simon, trailing a small group of trusted aides and advisors. There were no ceremonial press briefings, no foreign allies notified of the arrival, and no official public schedules released. Every single detail of this journey had been buried in the deepest shadows of Washington diplomacy, designed to obscure a desperate mission that could reorder global finance. The air inside the dark sedans awaiting them on the runway was heavy with intense, unspoken tension as they drove toward the royal palace in Jeddah. Simon was a former Wall Street bond trader, a hard-nosed practical thinker who understood high-stakes financial leverage far better than traditional statecraft. He was not visiting the kingdom to exchange friendly diplomatic pleasantries or sign routine commercial agreements. He was executing a secret maneuver to rescue the American financial system from catastrophic collapse before time ran out on the superpower. Back home across the Atlantic, the economic foundation of the United States was unraveling at a speed that deeply terrified federal policymakers. The 1973 OPEC oil embargo had struck the Western world like a sudden seismic shock, quadrupling global crude oil prices in a matter of months. Gas station lines stretched for miles down city avenues. Panicked motorists fought over fuel rationing coupons, and the cost of transporting basic food supplies skyrocketed. This was not merely a temporary market downturn, but the painful arrival of a terrifying new economic crisis known as stagflation. The giant American industrial engine was choking on sky-high energy prices, while consumer unemployment mounted and economic growth ground to a complete halt. Decades of post-war prosperity seemed to evaporate almost overnight. Washington was facing an existential reckoning, staring directly into the terrifying prospect of domestic instability and national bankruptcy. To halt this devastating economic hemorrhage, officials inside the U.S. Treasury needed a bold financial mechanism capable of forcing the entire world to pump wealth back into the American banking system. They required an essential global commodity, an indispensable resource so vital to modern civilization that no country on earth could survive without purchasing it every single day. Inside the shaded, cool palace chambers in Jeddah, William Simon sat across from top Saudi officials with a radical and audacious pitch. He understood the profound, unspoken vulnerability haunting the Saudi monarchy. The kingdom sat atop the largest ocean of crude oil on earth, generating unimaginable revenue, yet it was geographically surrounded by aggressive regional rivals and entirely lacked the heavy military infrastructure required to defend its borders. The secret proposal carried by the American delegation targeted that exact existential fear with cold, surgical precision. The United States offered absolute defense commitments, ironclad military backing, and advanced weaponry to guarantee the royal family's survival against any external or internal threat. In exchange, Saudi Arabia had to make one unyielding pledge: price every single barrel of Saudi crude oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars, while refusing to accept any other foreign currency. Furthermore, the hidden mechanics of the deal stipulated that Saudi Arabia would take its vast accumulating surplus of oil revenue and automatically funnel those petrodollars directly back into U.S. Treasury debt, effectively financing the balance sheet of the nation protecting them. This high-stakes economic bargain was born out of sheer necessity following a dramatic event 3 years earlier. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon walked into the Oval Office and announced a historic decision that shook the foundation of global commerce, known forever as the Nixon Shock. Unilaterally and without warning international partners, Nixon severed the U.S. dollar's long-standing convertible link to physical gold at Camp David. For nearly 3 decades, global trust in paper greenbacks had relied on a simple guarantee. Every dollar was backed by actual bullion secured in government vaults. By terminating that convertibility, the Nixon administration left the currency floating on nothing more than government promises and confidence. Foreign central banks began dumping their paper holdings, international trade balances collapsed, and market participants questioned whether an unbacked fiat dollar could maintain its value. Without the solid foundation of physical gold backing every transaction, the paper dollar sat exposed on global currency exchanges, vulnerable to runaway inflation and catastrophic collapse. Washington had no intention of restoring the traditional gold standard to rescue its falling currency. Instead, American planners executed one of the most audacious structural substitutions in modern history, replacing gold with black gold as the silent pillar of global commerce. By tying the greenback directly to the world's primary energy supply, the United States transformed crude oil into the ultimate backing for its paper currency, creating a mechanism far more powerful than gold had ever been. The consequences of this quiet arrangement sent shockwaves across every corner of the global economy. From that moment onward, any nation seeking to run its factories, heat its cities, or supply its transportation networks had no choice but to accumulate US dollars to buy Saudi crude. Foreign governments were forced to build massive cash reserves of greenbacks in their central banks, creating a permanent mandatory demand for American currency that allowed Washington to print money and issue debt with unprecedented freedom. This new agreement delivered the final blow to the post-World War II monetary framework established at Bretton Woods. Under that 1944 international treaty, 44 nations had agreed to use the dollar as the primary global reserve, but only because Washington promised to redeem $35 for one physical ounce of gold upon request. As European economies recovered during the 1960s, foreign governments accumulated huge dollar surpluses and routinely demanded their promised gold shipments. The resulting drain on American bullion reserves threatened to deplete Fort Knox completely, exposing the reality that the United States had printed far more dollar than its gold supplies could ever redeem. In the quiet, air-conditioned meeting rooms of Saudi Arabia in 1974, the gold-backed financial order was quietly erased from history. As pen met paper, a new global monetary system emerged, one anchored not to silver or gold in subterranean vaults, but to energy, sovereign debt, and the overwhelming reach of American military firepower. The sheer scale of this monetary panic had been escalating for years, reaching a dramatic peak when French President Charles de Gaulle made a brazen public statement of distrust. He dispatched French Navy warships across the Atlantic, carrying millions of paper dollar directly into New York Harbor with strict orders to exchange them for physical gold bullion from American subterranean vaults. In the corridors of power in Washington, government officials watched with rising panic as entire rooms of golden bars were loaded onto foreign ships, exposing the terrifying reality that the empire was rapidly running out of precious metal reserves. This explicit challenge struck at the very core of American financial confidence and global authority. If other allied nations followed France's aggressive lead and demanded their sovereign reserves in pure metal, the United States Treasury faced absolute, unavoidable bankruptcy before the decade was out. The psychological shock sent tremors through the political establishment as leaders realized that paper promises could no longer mask the growing unsustainable gap between American foreign spending and tangible gold holdings. While that dramatic naval showdown forced President Richard Nixon to abruptly close the gold window in August 1971, the underlying monetary crisis remained entirely unsolved. Without gold anchoring the greenback, global currency markets plunged into uncharted waters, leaving the American dollar floating aimlessly on foreign exchanges with its long-term future in deep jeopardy. In the immediate aftermath of severing the gold link, the value of the paper dollar plummeted across Europe and Asia. Foreign central banks, suddenly holding trillions in paper currency that could no longer be redeemed for anything tangible, began dumping their reserves onto open markets, causing American trade deficits to tip heavily negative, while import costs surged for domestic consumers. The global trading system lost its central anchor, creating an unpredictable environment where international businesses could no longer calculate long-term contracts. Without a physical commodity backing the paper note, world commerce risked fragmenting into isolated regional trading blocks. Nations began demanding local commodities or physical silver in private settlements, threatening to isolate the American financial sector and strip Washington of its unprecedented ability to print money without triggering immediate destructive domestic inflation. The entire architecture of Western economic power faced structural collapse unless a new, indispensable asset could be bound directly to the currency. As global currency markets reeled from the collapse of the fixed exchange standard, a sudden geopolitical crisis erupted in the Middle East that transformed this ongoing monetary breakdown into an urgent existential energy shock. In October 1973, war erupted across the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, prompting Arab members of the OPEC oil cartel to impose a crushing oil embargo against the United States and its Western allies. Almost overnight, daily life in American cities ground to an agonizing halt. Panicked drivers queued for miles in freezing conditions before dawn at suburban service stations, watching armed police officers patrol pump lines as wooden signs reading "out of gas" were nailed to shut storefronts. In major industrial centers, streetlights were switched off, office skyscrapers extinguished their lights after sunset, and assembly plants went completely quiet as emergency power rationing took hold across the country. A cold, bleak winter set in across the industrial heartland, leaving millions of working citizens feeling deeply vulnerable in a nation that had long assumed its energy supplies and material dominance were permanent features of modern life. While the embargo choked off physical energy deliveries, the political strategy behind it allowed the cartel to quadruple the benchmark price of crude oil almost overnight, imposing unprecedented financial costs on every fuel-importing country. The sudden surge in energy prices inflicted severe, quantifiable damage across the entire global economy. Crude oil prices quadrupled from under $3 a barrel to over $11.65 in a matter of months, driving American inflation past 10% almost instantly. Industrial output collapsed while unemployment figures reached historic post-war highs, giving birth to a toxic economic nightmare known as stagflation that established academic models claimed could never exist. This paralyzing combination of soaring consumer prices and stagnant economic growth shattered the post-war Keynesian orthodoxy. Traditional government intervention failed completely because raising interest rates to combat runaway inflation only worsened unemployment, while lowering rates to stimulate business activity triggered immediate catastrophic spikes in energy costs, leaving central bankers completely helpless as sovereign debt accumulated. Inside the White House cabinet room, a profound sense of paralysis took hold among economic advisors and national security officials who realized that the vital engine of Western industrial production was now completely exposed to foreign oil producers. It was during this moment of severe geopolitical vulnerability that Secretary of State Henry Kissinger identified a brilliant transformative strategic mechanism. He recognized that while gold was a passive asset sitting uselessly in underground vaults, oil was an active, indispensable energy source that every industrialized nation was required to purchase every single day to fuel its factories, power its power grids, and keep its transport networks moving. Kissinger realized that if Washington could ensure that all global oil settlements were conducted exclusively in United States dollars, every country on Earth would be forced to accumulate paper dollars to secure its basic energy needs. This structural requirement would generate an artificial, permanent global demand for the dollar, effectively replacing Fort Knox with the vast petroleum reserves of the Persian Gulf and locking in American financial dominance for generations. With this grand strategy formulated behind closed doors, high-level American envoys boarded unmarked transport aircraft bound for the desert heat of the Arabian Peninsula, carrying secret proposals designed to quietly re-engineer the global monetary system. In Riyadh, King Faisal and the senior princes of the House of Saud faced their own deep existential anxieties despite the floodwaters of wealth flowing from high oil prices. Surrounded by aggressive Soviet-backed regimes in neighboring Iraq and South Yemen, and haunted by the constant threat of internal military uprisings, the Saudi monarchy recognized that paper wealth meant nothing if they lacked the military capacity to defend their territory and preserve their royal line. The ruling royal family understood that their vast, unfortified oil fields were an irresistible prize for regional powers and revolutionary movements alike. Every barrel of oil drawn from the sand increased their wealth, but it also multiplied their geopolitical risk, leaving the king in urgent need of an ironclad security umbrella that no regional coalition or international body could realistically offer. This acute Saudi vulnerability provided American diplomats with the exact leverage required to finalize a monumental deal, establishing a historic U.S.-Saudi arrangement where American security guarantees, advanced arms exports, and regime protection were exchanged for Saudi Arabia pricing all petroleum exports exclusively in greenbacks and recycling those massive dollar surpluses back into United States Treasury bonds. To engineer this financial lifeline, Washington turned to William Simon, a former Salomon Brothers partner known on Wall Street as the Treasury's Bond King. Newly appointed as Treasury Secretary, Simon carried a quiet, heavy burden into the shadows of international diplomacy. His objective was not merely to negotiate a commercial contract, but to construct a secret financial architecture that could save the United States from total economic collapse without alerting the public or alarming foreign central banks. Stepping onto an unmarked military aircraft in July 1974, Simon knew that failure was not an option. If he returned empty-handed, the runaway inflation destroying the American economy would compound into a sovereign debt crisis, shattering the nation's standing as a global superpower. He was flying directly into the realm of an absolute monarchy that held all the strategic leverage, risking his career and his country's future on an untested financial gamble. While public statements framed William Simon's journey as a routine diplomatic tour of Middle Eastern capitals, the real itinerary was tightly guarded to hide the true purpose of his mission. He landed in Saudi Arabia under the guise of broad economic cooperation, masking the intense private financial maneuvering that was about to unfold behind closed doors. Inside a secluded royal palace in Jeddah, the atmosphere was thick with tension and heavy heat. Heavy drapes shielded the carpeted room from the blazing desert sun, while silent attendants served traditional cardamom tea. The contrast was stark. Wall Street financiers in dark, stifling woolen suits sat across low tables from Saudi royals in flowing white robes, separated by vast cultural differences but bound together by mutual desperation. The only sound in the room was the soft clinking of teacups against porcelain and the hum of air conditioning units struggling against the oppressive coastal air. Outside, the port city bustled unaware, but inside the dim chamber, the air felt unbreathable. Every glance was measured, every pause loaded with significance, as both sides recognized that the survival of their respective systems hung in the balance. Though initial pleasantries were exchanged with practiced courtly grace, the shadow of mounting economic crisis quickly forced all polite ceremony aside. William Simon opened his leather briefcase, laying down cold financial spreadsheets that stripped away any remaining illusion of conventional diplomatic banter. What followed in that quiet room was the systematic drafting of the 1974 U.S.-Saudi Accord, a historic blueprint that would fundamentally rewrite the rules of global commerce for generations. Moving away from vague political promises, the negotiators began carving out the precise financial machinery required to bind energy and debt into a single, indivisible system. This was the precise moment where sovereign vulnerability met cold institutional calculations. Two nations, driven by entirely different survival fears, sat down to build a synthetic replacement for the broken gold standard, constructing a global economic engine powered not by precious metal, but by crude oil and American government debt. As the negotiations peaked, William Simon leaned forward and presented Washington's explicit ultimatum directly to the Saudi ministers. He offered absolute military protection, advanced weapon systems, and guaranteed regime survival, but demanded complete financial compliance in return. The room grew dead silent as the full weight of the American proposal settled over the table. Saudi officials exchanged guarded looks, feeling the gravity of the choice before them. To accept meant tying their kingdom's fate permanently to American hegemony, while to refuse meant facing regional enemies and potential internal collapse without a defense shield. The tension in the palace room was almost visible, etched onto the stern, unreadable faces of the ministers. With the stakes laid bare across the bargaining table, the Saudi monarchy made its choice, setting the stage for the formal agreement. The raw power dynamics of that high-stakes confrontation quietly dissolved into the permanent reality of binding structural commitments that would govern international finance. The first core pillar of the secret accord was remarkably simple and absolute. Saudi Arabia agreed to price every single barrel of its oil exports exclusively in United States dollars. No Deutsche Marks, no Japanese yen, no French francs, and no British pounds would ever be accepted. If any nation on earth wanted to purchase Saudi petroleum, it was required to acquire American greenbacks first. By locking oil pricing to the dollar, the agreement generated a permanent, artificial demand for American currency across the globe. Factories in Europe and power plants in Asia could not operate without oil, which meant foreign governments were forced to constantly sell their own goods and services to obtain the dollars needed to keep their economies running. This exclusive dollar pricing requirement was quickly expanded far beyond Saudi borders, as the kingdom used its immense production capacity and dominant position within OPEC to ensure that fellow oil-producing nations adopted the exact same currency mandate across all global crude sales. The immediate global consequence was a massive financial shift that caught central banks entirely off guard. Nations like Japan, West Germany, and France had to sell huge amounts of their local currencies on open markets to amass vast stockpiles of American dollars, effectively backing the greenback through their own economic sacrifice. Virtually overnight, foreign trade balances were restructured to prioritize dollar accumulation above all else. Central banks around the globe realized that holding American paper was no longer an option, but an absolute prerequisite for national energy security, cementing the dollar as the world's undisputed reserve asset. Finance ministers across Europe and Asia watched in helpless frustration as their sovereign monetary policy was subordinated to the decisions of the Federal Reserve. They were trapped in a system where they had to export real physical goods just to acquire paper notes issued by Washington, feeling the quiet sting of a global financial tax they never voted for. The second crucial mechanism of the deal addressed the overwhelming flood of cash flowing into Saudi coffers, known as petrodollar recycling. Because the vast windfall of oil profits could cause massive inflation if dumped into the local Saudi economy, Washington engineered a dedicated channel to siphon those extra billions directly back into United States Treasury securities. To understand the genius of petrodollar recycling, one must look at the mathematical nightmare facing the Saudi royal family in 1974. Quadrupled crude prices brought unprecedented rivers of paper wealth into Riyadh. But the domestic Saudi economy was tiny, underdeveloped, and completely incapable of absorbing billions of sudden cash without causing devastating internal inflation. If those surplus revenues were allowed to sit idle or flood local markets, they threatened to tear the kingdom's delicate social order apart. Washington stepped forward with an elegant solution, offering the vast liquid depths of the United States debt market as the ultimate monetary shock absorber for Saudi Arabia's excess oil profits. Across the sun-baked administrative offices of the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority, ledger entries began reflecting a historic transfer of financial gravity. Millions of physical barrels of crude pumped from the eastern desert sandstones were instantly translated into quiet digital claims, stored thousands of miles away in American bank vaults. To make this transfer seamless and completely invisible to global markets, the United States Treasury created a specialized mechanism known as the add-on facility. Under normal rules, sovereign governments buying American government debt had to compete in open public auctions, where massive bids could drive interest rates down and signal major shifting tactics to rival nations. The add-on facility bypassed this public floor entirely, allowing the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority to purchase non-competitive treasury bonds directly from the government at market-clearing prices. This covert administrative channel meant Riyadh could park hundreds of millions of oil dollars into long-term American bonds every single week without leaving a visible footprint on open trading desks. Wall Street bond dealers remained entirely oblivious to the vast sums quietly flowing from Middle Eastern petroleum accounts directly into the federal balance sheet, preserving market stability while constructing an unprecedented financial lifeline between two distant capitals. The immediate result of this hidden pipe was extraordinary, providing Washington with a virtually infinite line of credit that allowed the Federal Reserve to issue money and finance expanding national deficits without suffering the traditional economic penalty of rapid currency devaluation. Yet this secret arrangement carried immense geopolitical danger for the ruling House of Saud, who lived in constant dread of exposure. During a decade marked by fierce pan-Arab nationalism and bitter regional conflict, key OPEC members like Algeria, Iraq, and Libya openly denounced Western imperialism and demanded that oil wealth be used as a weapon against Israel and its allies. If radical regimes discovered that Saudi Arabia was secretly lending its billions back to Washington to fund the American government, the political fallout across the Arab world would be catastrophic. King Faisal and his advisors operated under the terrifying weight of potential betrayal, knowing that a single leaked balance sheet could spark domestic unrest, provoke regional war, or destroy their legitimacy as guardians of Islam's holy sites. They demanded an absolute guarantee of total anonymity from the Treasury Department, insisting that Saudi holdings of American debt be buried inside aggregate, untraceable global accounting lines where no journalist or congressional investigator could ever isolate them, while financial secrecy protected the kingdom from political backlashes abroad. Financial arrangements alone could not secure the physical survival of the royal family against internal coups or foreign invasion. To complete the triangle of power, Washington coupled petrodollar recycling with an unprecedented defense commitment, promising the full protective shield of the United States military to ensure the survival of the Saudi monarchy. Under the third core clause of the agreement, the Pentagon undertook the complete modernization of the Saudi armed forces, agreeing to supply state-of-the-art weaponry, advanced radar defense systems, and comprehensive military training programs. This military commitment established a second closed financial loop that complemented the bond market facility. As Saudi Arabia accumulated endless dollar reserves from global energy sales, billions of those dollars were immediately redirected back into the American defense industrial base to pay for advanced fighter jets, armored vehicles, and massive military infrastructure contracts. American defense contractors became deeply entrenched inside the kingdom, effectively locking Saudi national security directly to the technological and industrial output of the United States. Contracting teams from major defense corporations established permanent operations in Riyadh and Dhahran, managing multi-billion-dollar procurements that were tied directly to oil revenues. Every shipment of high-tech hardware required ongoing American technical support, spare parts, and advisory personnel, ensuring that the Saudi military could not operate its own primary weapons platforms without the continuous active assistance of the United States. To provide a legitimate public cover for this massive bilateral integration, the two nations formally announced the establishment of the United States-Saudi Arabian Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation. On paper, this joint organization was framed as a benign civilian initiative designed to help Saudi Arabia build modern roads, power plants, water desalination facilities, and agricultural networks using American engineering expertise. Beneath this diplomatic veneer lay a deep state mechanism that systematically awarded the largest infrastructure projects on Earth to premier American engineering giants like Bechtel. Massive modern cities were drawn on blueprints in California and constructed in the Arabian desert, ensuring that even civilian infrastructure spending recycled billions back into the balance sheets of American corporations. The daily administrative machinery of the Joint Commission was deliberately run directly out of the Treasury building in Washington rather than the State Department, cutting standard diplomatic bureaucracy out of the loop entirely. A dedicated cadre of Treasury officials oversaw the flow of contracts and capital, ensuring that economic policy and monetary control remained strictly unified under a single financial command structure. This centralization of power created intense friction within the Nixon administration, sparking bitter turf wars across the upper echelons of Washington power. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Treasury Secretary William Simon operated with cold, solitary efficiency, intentionally excluding career diplomats and foreign service officers who favored traditional, transparent diplomacy over secretive financial pacts. State Department officials felt marginalized and deeply uneasy as they watched the fundamental architecture of international monetary policy be rewritten in secret meetings without congressional oversight or public debate. Kissinger remained unmoved by their institutional complaints, driven by a calculated belief that preserving American financial supremacy required absolute control, absolute discretion, and the ruthless execution of realpolitik. Inside the wood-paneled corridors of Foggy Bottom and the Treasury headquarters, high-stakes cabinet battles burned behind closed doors, masked by carefully drafted press releases that disclosed virtually nothing of the underlying mechanics. While career officials argued over constitutional precedent and diplomatic protocol, Kissinger had already secured the core machinery that would govern global energy markets for the next half-century. With the pact between Washington and Riyadh firmly cemented, Saudi Arabia used its immense structural influence as OPEC's dominant producer to bring the rest of the petroleum cartel into compliance. Any oil-producing nation that contemplated accepting alternative currencies was swiftly reminded that Saudi Arabia possessed the market capacity to flood global supply lines, drive prices down, and crush competitors overnight, leaving no foreign capital with any choice but to price every barrel of crude strictly in American dollars. Saudi Arabia held the ultimate trump card in energy markets as the cartel's dominant swing producer. By threatening to flood the market with cheap crude oil and decimate the profit margins of any country that strayed, Riyadh forced the rest of OPEC into strict compliance. Within months, every oil exporter from Kuwait to Venezuela fell into line, making dollar denomination non-negotiable for all petroleum transactions across the globe. With OPEC's compliance firmly locked down, global energy markets no longer had an alternative payment route. Foreign central banks across Europe and Asia were forced to continuously dump their own domestic currencies to buy dollars on open exchanges, generating a perpetual structural demand for American fiat money in every financial center on Earth. On the high-volume trading desks of Lower Manhattan in late 1974, telex machines clattered continuously, spitting out endless rolls of paper orders from Middle Eastern financial institutions. Dimly lit trading rooms hummed with unprecedented tension as young brokers in rolled-up sleeves worked through the night, desperately routing hundreds of millions of petrodollars from Middle Eastern bank accounts straight into Manhattan financial instruments. Under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, paper ledger sheets filled with staggering numbers as mountain after mountain of oil cash swept through major Wall Street investment houses. Wire transfer infrastructure and bank accounting departments strained under the sheer volume of foreign capital, turning the narrow streets of New York's financial district into the undisputed command center of global energy liquidity. This massive rush of Wall Street transactions was not a temporary market spike, but the birth of a permanent monetary superhighway. As vast streams of oil revenues poured into Manhattan financial institutions day after day, the closed-loop machinery engineered by Washington began to turn, locking global power dynamics into a rigid financial grid. The petrodollar recycling loop functioned as a perfectly closed, self-sustaining monetary cycle. First, the United States printed unbacked paper dollars to purchase foreign crude oil. Second, foreign oil exporters collected these massive dollar reserves and immediately recycled them back into Washington by purchasing U.S. Treasury bonds, effectively lending the very same capital directly back to the government that printed it. This extraordinary arrangement meant the United States Treasury could finance massive budget deficits and overseas military expansions without raising domestic taxes or triggering immediate hyperinflation. By forcing every oil-importing country to accumulate dollars to fuel their industries, Washington converted a mounting national debt burden into an automated, self-funding global tax mechanism. While this recycling loop allowed Washington to absorb endless national debt, it required intricate coordination behind closed doors. The capital could not sit idle in government vaults. It had to move rapidly through private commercial channels to maintain global liquidity and fuel continuous lending expansion. This closed-loop system gave birth to Exorbitant Privilege 2.0, a far more potent mechanism than the post-war Bretton Woods regime. While Charles de Gaulle had complained about America's post-war monetary dominance under a gold standard, this new petrodollar architecture granted Washington an even more unprecedented capability: the power to import physical goods, oil, and labor in exchange for paper currency it alone possessed the right to create. No sovereign power in modern history had ever operated with such absolute monetary leverage. While every other nation had to produce real, tangible wealth to earn foreign exchange reserves before purchasing vital energy imports, the United States simply printed the digital balance entries required to keep its economy running, effectively exporting its domestic inflation to foreign shores. For American policy architects, this absolute financial dominance felt like an unassailable triumph of monetary engineering. Yet for developing nations, it created an insidious trap, forcing millions of ordinary working people across the globe to surrender real physical resources and labor just to acquire paper dollars controlled entirely by politicians in Washington. Private Wall Street megabanks, including Citibank, Chase Manhattan, and Morgan Guaranty, stepped directly into this lucrative pipeline to manage the unprecedented cash inflows. These financial behemoths absorbed short-term Saudi offshore dollar deposits, known as euro dollars, which sat in European branches beyond the reach of domestic reserve requirements and federal regulatory oversight. Operating with virtually no reserve limits, these private megabanks aggressively multiplied credit and built massive leverage on top of their petrodollar deposits. Banking executives harvested enormous fees by packaging this ocean of excess liquidity into high-yield, variable-rate loans, actively seeking out sovereign borrowers across the developing world who were desperate for cash to cover rising energy costs. Inside dark, mahogany-paneled boardrooms overlooking London and Manhattan, senior bankers toasted to endless profit expansion as international wire transfers flashed across green monitor screens. Glossy oak conference tables were covered in thick sovereign loan contracts, stamped with the seals of developing governments, signed by leaders who blindly accepted onerous debt terms in exchange for fast liquidity. This reckless lending expansion quietly sowed the seeds for a devastating international financial crisis. Wall Street commercial banks aggressively pushed billions of recycled petrodollars onto vulnerable governments across Latin America and Africa, locking these developing countries into massive loans with floating interest rates that seemed manageable only as long as global borrowing costs remained low. When the Federal Reserve abruptly raised American interest rates to unprecedented heights years later to crush domestic inflation, those variable-rate loans transformed into inescapable debt traps. Dozens of developing nations were suddenly pushed toward catastrophic sovereign defaults, forced to dismantle public infrastructure and surrender national sovereignty just to satisfy monthly interest payments to Wall Street creditors. The legal terms embedded in these petrodollar loan contracts made debt relief virtually impossible, explicitly forbidding sovereign nations from restructuring without total creditor approval. As default crises spread, international lending institutions intervened to enforce severe structural adjustment programs, ensuring that Western commercial banks received full payment while local populations endured deep cuts to basic social safety nets. In the final calculation, this intricate petrodollar loop forged an impenetrable geopolitical shield around American financial dominance. Foreign central banks holding hundreds of billions in U.S. Treasury bonds became economic hostages to Washington's financial stability, realizing that any attempt to abandon the dollar would trigger a total collapse of their own national reserves and ruin their own economies. Because foreign central banks held hundreds of billions in Treasury bonds, any rapid collapse of the U.S. dollar would instantly wipe out their own financial reserves. Global leaders found themselves caught in a silent, high-stakes trap where defending the currency of their chief economic rival was the only way to prevent their own immediate national bankruptcy. Washington had effectively converted its mounting national debt into a permanent geopolitical shield, binding the survival of sovereign governments across Western Europe, South America, and East Asia directly to the financial stability of the American printing press. This geopolitical trap was not an accidental byproduct of chaotic market forces, but the calculated outcome of a deliberate financial strategy meticulously designed and executed in the highest corridors of American power. Declassified internal memos from the Treasury Department reveal explicit mathematical calculations behind the Petrodollar Agreement. Senior government economists carefully projected that guaranteed bond purchases by Saudi Arabia and other Gulf nations would suppress American federal borrowing costs by 50 to 100 basis points across all debt maturities. By artificially creating vast, perpetual foreign demand for government debt, Washington systematically lowered its own borrowing costs by billions of dollars every single year. These confidential accounting records show Treasury specialists tracking every major oil payout, following the capital from Middle Eastern oil fields straight into secret auction windows in New York. Special non-competitive bidding rules were established so the Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency could buy newly issued Treasury bonds in complete secrecy, bypassing standard public reporting requirements without altering prevailing market prices or alerting competing commercial traders on Wall Street. Those secret Treasury memos proved that by forcing global energy trade into dollars, the United States could comfortably run massive, unprecedented trade deficits that would have triggered catastrophic currency crashes and immediate sovereign bankruptcies in any other nation on Earth. On March 25, 1975, a sudden violent shock threatened to smash this delicate financial machinery to pieces. Inside the royal palace in Riyadh, King Faisal was holding a routine diplomatic audience when his nephew stepped forward, pulled a concealed handgun, and fired 3 point-blank shots into the monarch. Sirens pierced the desert heat as palace guards scrambled through marble corridors, while news of the king's assassination flashed across international telegraph wires within minutes. In Washington, emergency telephone lines lit up across the Treasury and State Department offices in the middle of the night. High-level officials gathered in dim, tense conference rooms, desperately analyzing intelligence cables to confirm whether the assassination was part of a broader anti-American coup that would instantly dismantle the secret petrodollar pact and cut off the monetary recycling loop. For several agonizing hours, American decision-makers felt the profound fragility of their new economic order, realizing that decades of projected monetary dominance hung entirely on the political survival and personal loyalty of a single vulnerable ruling family in Riyadh. The panic proved short-lived, as the Saudi institutional structure held remarkably firm despite the bloody palace tragedy. King Khalid immediately ascended the throne with Prince Fahd managing daily state governance, and the new leadership promptly dispatched confidential messages to Washington, confirming that every financial commitment made in 1974 remained fully intact. The structural financial incentives built into the agreement were already so powerful that even the murder of a sovereign king could not interrupt the economic engine. Oil continued to flow out of Persian Gulf ports, payments continued to clear strictly in greenbacks, and massive waves of surplus capital kept pouring back into American government debt auctions. The smooth transition demonstrated that the petrodollar system had successfully evolved beyond individual personalities, transforming into an automated global apparatus that operated far above regional political violence. Across financial trading desks from London to Tokyo, ticker tapes barely stuttered as wire transfers moving hundreds of millions of petrodollars landed precisely on schedule in Manhattan commercial bank accounts. By the close of the 1970s, this unbroken continuity finalized one of the most profound monetary transformations in human history. The United States had successfully shifted from an inflated post-gold currency vulnerable to foreign bank runs into an inescapable debt-backed reserve system anchored directly by global energy consumption. Global economic dominance was no longer measured by tons of physical gold bullion stored in subterranean vaults, but by electronic ledger entries bound to American financial markets and enforced by unmatched military deployment capability. Under this consolidated standard, every non-American central bank was forced to route its energy payments through correspondent banking networks operating within the United States. If a Japanese utility company needed to purchase crude oil from Saudi Arabia, it first had to export manufactured goods to American consumers to earn dollars, then clear those exact funds through major clearinghouses located in downtown New York. This mandatory clearing architecture gave American banks an unprecedented view into global commercial transactions, while generating billions in steady fee revenue on nearly every oil barrel traded on Earth. The rigid mechanics of international central banking ensured that foreign nations absorbed all currency exchange risks, while Washington held absolute administrative control over the international transaction ledger. This structure created a profound asymmetry at the heart of global trade, forming a financial arrangement where real physical goods were traded for paper debt promises. While factory workers in Europe, Latin America, and Asia labored to extract raw minerals, harvest crops, and manufacture complex physical products to acquire currency, the United States produced those same dollars electronically at zero material cost. By exchanging paper debt and digital credit for vital raw materials and finished consumer products, America effectively exported its domestic monetary inflation to foreign markets. Overseas central banks absorbed these surplus dollars to prevent their own national currencies from appreciating too rapidly, storing their accumulated national wealth in low-yielding American government bonds that gradually lost purchasing power over time. This endless foreign demand for government debt allowed Washington to finance expanding federal deficits without immediate fiscal discipline, setting the stage for deep industrial shifts that would soon transform the domestic economy of the United States forever. This endless stream of recycled capital came with a severe domestic price that rippled across the American heartland. Because global demand for greenbacks remained unnaturally high, the dollar maintained an artificially strong exchange rate decade after decade. That persistent currency strength made foreign manufactured goods remarkably cheap for American consumers, but it simultaneously crippled domestic industrial exporters. American factories found themselves priced out of international competition, unable to match the low costs of overseas producers whose currencies were not inflated by a global energy monopsony. Across the industrial belt of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Indiana, smokestacks gradually went cold and assembly lines ground to a sudden halt. Steel mills, auto plants, and textile factories shuttered their doors, displacing hundreds of thousands of skilled workers into economic uncertainty. The petrodollar system had effectively arranged a structural trade-off, prioritizing foreign debt expansion and cheap consumer imports over the survival of domestic manufacturing communities. While this industrial decay dismantled middle-class manufacturing towns, the financial engine feeding Washington only gained momentum. The steady inflow of foreign capital ensured that the United States government could issue massive amounts of debt without paying the high interest rates that normally punish overspending. Under standard economic rules, chronic trade deficits and runaway budget expansion trigger currency depreciation and rising borrowing costs. But the petrodollar loop acted as a perpetual shock absorber, forcing foreign central banks to absorb American treasury debt regardless of how much paper Washington produced. The numerical impact of this artificial demand was immediate and staggering. In 1974, when Henry Kissinger finalized the Saudi Agreement, the United States national debt stood at roughly $475 billion. By the late 1980s, that figure surpassed $3 trillion, and by the turn of the century, it was accelerating past $5 trillion. Foreign oil buyers and central banks absorbed hundreds of billions of these treasury bonds, effectively funding Washington's federal budget deficits year after year. This continuous absorption of federal paper allowed American politicians to offer low taxes alongside expanding government budgets without facing immediate financial discipline. Foreign nations were essentially trapped into subsidizing the domestic policy choices of the United States. If an overseas nation wanted to buy energy, it had to buy dollars, and the safest place to park those dollars was back inside the United States debt market. This steady flow of foreign funds gave American lawmakers a sense of financial invincibility, creating the illusion that federal spending faced no natural economic boundaries. For the communities left behind by factory closures, the contrast was sharp and painful. While political leaders operated with an endless line of credit, ordinary families in former manufacturing hubs faced stagnant wages, lost pensions, and decaying public infrastructure. This shift in national capital flows transformed the very structure of the American economy, steering wealth away from physical production toward the boardrooms of high finance. Wall Street replaced the factory floor as the primary driver of national economic expansion. Investment banks, brokerage firms, and private equity funds grew rapidly, developing complex financial instruments designed to trade, package, and leverage the ocean of global debt moving through New York. Engineering talent that once designed automobiles, aircraft, and heavy machinery was increasingly drawn toward financial engineering. Complex mathematical models, structured derivatives, and algorithmic trading desks took center stage, extracting profit from money management rather than industrial output. The economic power of the country was no longer rooted in what its factories built, but in its exclusive control over the global currency architecture. This quiet financialization altered the social fabric of the country, creating unprecedented wealth for financial elites, while real wages for blue-collar workers stagnated for decades. Main Street was gradually emptied out, replaced by an economy reliant on consumer credit and foreign capital to maintain its standard of living. Beyond its domestic consequences, control over the global dollar standard granted Washington an unprecedented geopolitical tool. Because every international oil transaction had to clear through American banking channels, the United States Treasury effectively built a digital choke point over world commerce. By controlling access to dollar clearing networks, Washington could instantly track, restrict, or block the financial transactions of any nation, company, or individual anywhere on Earth. Through the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control and key clearing banks in New York, the government gained the power to enforce economic isolation without firing a single shot. Cutting a sovereign nation off from dollar settlements meant denying its ability to buy fuel, import food, or sell its own natural resources on the open market. The petrodollar mechanism had evolved from a simple monetary arrangement into a lethal system of economic coercion. For governments across the developing world, this reality presented a stark dynamic. Compliance with American financial policy was no longer just a matter of trade relations, but a requirement for basic economic survival. A single decision in Washington could freeze a country's foreign central bank reserves, overnight rendering its national currency worthless and collapsing its domestic economy. The absolute authority of this framework faced its first direct challenge in November 2000 in the quiet halls of the Iraqi Ministry of Oil in Baghdad. Saddam Hussein announced that Iraq would no longer accept United States dollars for its oil exports under the United Nations Oil for Food program. Instead, Baghdad demanded payment exclusively in euros, converting its multi-billion-dollar United Nations reserve account at the central bank in Paris. At the time, the European currency was trading at record lows against the greenback, making the Iraqi decision appear purely political and financially reckless. Yet, as the euro rapidly appreciated over the following 2 years, Iraq earned significant profits on its oil sales, proving that a major petroleum exporter could successfully bypass the dollar system. To policy analysts in Washington, this proved that the petrodollar framework possessed a fragile vulnerability that could spread if other oil-exporting nations chose to follow Iraq's lead. The Iraqi experiment sent shockwaves through the diplomatic corridors of the West, demonstrating that the global energy market could function without the greenback. If OPEC members saw that selling oil in foreign currencies yielded economic benefits, the artificial demand backing the United States financial system could rapidly evaporate. The implicit rule established in 1974 was under threat, and the systemic consequences of that challenge were impossible to ignore. A similar threat emerged years later in North Africa, when Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi began rallying African and Arab nations around an alternative monetary architecture. Gaddafi proposed creating a unified African currency backed directly by physical gold, known as the gold dinar. The plan called for pricing Africa's vast oil and mineral reserves exclusively in this new gold-backed currency, deliberately bypassing both the dollar and the euro. To prepare for this shift, Libya accumulated over 140 tons of physical gold reserves within its central bank vaults in Tripoli, fully unencumbered by Western debt obligations. Diplomatic cables later released from foreign governments revealed that Western intelligence agencies closely monitored the initiative, calculating that a gold-backed African energy currency would undermine Western financial dominance across the continent. The Libyan initiative highlighted the fundamental rule that governed the international monetary order established in 1974. Any attempt to detach energy pricing from the United States dollar was not viewed as a simple trade decision, but as a direct challenge to the financial structure of Western power. The petrodollar framework was designed to be self-preserving, and those who sought to dismantle its machinery faced severe and immediate geopolitical consequences. The true power of forcing energy transactions into American currency rested on the invisible plumbing of international banking. Every time a container ship loaded oil in the Persian Gulf, the money had to travel through messaging systems like SWIFT and financial settling centers in New York like CHIPS. Because these networks routed transactions in American dollars, the United States government gained absolute visibility over global trade. A bank in Europe or Asia could not move money for energy without touching an American server. This administrative oversight turned global commerce into a series of financial choke points controlled by Washington. If a sovereign nation defied American foreign policy, federal officials did not need to deploy naval blockades to cut off that nation's income. They simply disconnected its domestic banks from the SWIFT system or blocked its access to New York clearinghouses. By locking dissident states out of the dollar network, the United States could paralyze an entire national economy with the press of a key. Through these centralized financial pipelines, the rules established in 1974 became a global surveillance network that locked every oil-importing nation into strict compliance with Western terms. When the American housing market collapsed in 2008, triggering the worst financial crisis in modern history, the petrodollar architecture provided an extraordinary shield. As Wall Street investment firms folded and toxic assets threatened to destroy the domestic banking sector, the Federal Reserve took unprecedented action. Central bankers printed trillions of new dollars to buy up bad loans and flood the financial system with cash through quantitative easing, a move that under normal circumstances would spark catastrophic inflation. Because foreign central banks were legally and structurally required to accumulate dollars to purchase vital fuel, global demand for greenbacks absorbed this massive wave of new currency. Rather than causing hyperinflation inside the United States, the newly created money was absorbed across the globe as foreign governments quietly held American paper to pay their future energy bills. Washington effectively exported its financial ruin to the rest of the planet, forcing international trade partners to bear the real cost of American economic recovery. In late 2008, inside the quiet boardrooms of European and Asian central banks, officials watched the Federal Reserve print currency at an unprecedented rate, while knowing their own nations had no choice but to absorb those inflated notes. Over the decades, Saudi Arabia accumulated vast surpluses of recycled dollar through the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority. Initially, these funds were funneled almost exclusively into low-yield United States Treasury bonds, exactly as Henry Kissinger had structured in the 1974 deal. But as the kingdom's reserves expanded into hundreds of billions of dollars, Saudi leadership recognized the need to transform their paper wealth into permanent global influence through strategic equity investments across foreign economies. This realization led to the restructuring of the Public Investment Fund, turning it into one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. Instead of simply lending money back to the United States Treasury to fund American federal deficits, Saudi Arabia began buying controlling stakes in global technology corporations, infrastructure projects, real estate, and major entertainment conglomerates. Recycled petrodollars were no longer just funding Western government debt. They were directly buying up ownership of Western strategic assets. This shift from passive bondholding to aggressive asset acquisition turned the public investment fund into a massive financial engine, rewriting global corporate ownership while maintaining its core reliance on the dollar standard. For nearly 50 years, this intricate financial machine held the global economy together in a state of carefully engineered balance. American consumers enjoyed cheap foreign goods financed by cheap debt, while energy-producing nations traded finite natural resources for the guaranteed backing of the United States military and financial network. The 1974 agreement had built an unshakable empire of debt that survived Cold Wars, market crashes, and shifting geopolitical alliances across half a century. Yet, behind the apparent strength of this multi-decade monument, critical structural flaws began to widen beneath the surface. The sheer scale of American national debt, combined with the aggressive use of financial sanctions against rival economies, started to strain the delicate trust that kept foreign central banks tied to the dollar. The very tools designed to enforce petrodollar dominance were slowly convincing the rest of the world to search for a way out. A growing realization took hold among foreign finance ministers that relying entirely on a currency controlled by a single government left their own national security perpetually at the mercy of Washington. The quiet anxiety spreading through international financial centers was not about market volatility, but about the fundamental danger of building national survival upon paper promises that could be revoked at any moment. What had begun as a masterclass in economic diplomacy in 1974 was gradually turning into a rigid architecture that forced non-aligned states to calculate the exact cost of their economic dependency. In February 2022, the financial world experienced a sudden, seismic tremor that shattered decades of established monetary trust. Following the invasion of Ukraine, Western nations took the unprecedented step of freezing approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held in foreign accounts. Overnight, reserves that Moscow had accumulated over decades through energy sales were rendered completely inaccessible, converted into useless digital entries by executive decrees in Washington and Europe. Inside central bank vaults and finance ministries from Asia to South America, governors watched the news with stark comprehension. The event proved that sovereign reserves held in dollar-denominated assets were not sovereign at all if a country fell out of favor with the West. The absolute safety of foreign central bank holdings, long assumed to be the rock-solid foundation of the global monetary system, vanished in a single afternoon. The weaponization of global clearing networks and foreign reserves proved that holding American sovereign debt carried a severe political risk that no independent state could ignore indefinitely. This sudden realization sparked an immediate shift in how non-aligned nations viewed their financial reserves. Central bank governors realized that if the largest commodity exporter on earth could have $300 billion erased from its balance sheet overnight, no nation was safe. The silent trust that had sustained the petrodollar system for 50 years was permanently broken, sending a chill through international markets and accelerating a global search for an escape route from dollar hegemony. The unintended consequence of this financial freeze rippled far beyond Moscow. Finance ministers in capitals across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East suddenly saw American debt not as an unshakable store of value, but as a political instrument that could be turned against them at any moment. The implicit guarantee that had sustained 5 decades of dollar supremacy was shattered. Nations that spent generations accumulating dollar paper as safe savings began quietly questioning whether their economic sovereignty was built on quicksand. While Western leaders framed the asset freeze as a necessary defense of international order, foreign reserves managers immediately began seeking safer alternatives. The decision transformed global monetary strategy overnight, shifting the priority from maximizing yield on American securities to protecting nation-states against total financial isolation. In December 2022, Chinese President Xi Jinping landed in Riyadh for the Arab-China Summit. marking a historic shift in Middle Eastern diplomacy. Standing before leaders of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Chinese head of state explicitly proposed using the Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange to settle energy purchases in Chinese renminbi. For the first time in nearly 50 years, a Saudi monarch sat in a public hall and listened as a major strategic buyer proposed dismantling the exclusive dollar requirement established back in 1974. The proposal was far more than political rhetoric. It was backed by tangible trade balance realities. China had become Saudi Arabia's largest crude oil customer, purchasing over 1.7 million barrels per day while providing the kingdom with heavy machinery, consumer electronics, and infrastructure engineering. Settling those vast flows directly in local currency eliminated the need to hold excess dollars in Washington treasuries or route payments through clearinghouses in New York. This emergence of the petro-yuan challenged the fundamental feedback loop that Henry Kissinger had engineered half a century earlier. When oil proceeds bypass American accounts, the automatic demand for treasury debt begins to shrink, forcing the United States to find new buyers for its endlessly expanding mountain of federal obligations. At the exact same time, central banks around the world launched the largest physical gold buying spree in recorded history. Monetary authorities purchased over 1,000 metric tons of gold in a single year, moving away from sovereign debt paper toward an asset that carries zero counterparty risk and cannot be erased by administrative decree. This rush for physical bullion was accompanied by the dramatic expansion of the BRICS bloc, which opened its doors to major energy producers including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran. This economic realignment created an alternative trade architecture capable of operating entirely outside American jurisdiction. By establishing direct bilateral swap lines and non-dollar clearing mechanisms, participating states insulated their domestic industries from foreign sanctions and currency volatility, systematically chipping away at the global monopoly the dollar had enjoyed since the end of the Second World War. The diversification into gold and local currencies exposed a critical vulnerability in the modern monetary model. Without a forced global demand for dollars tied directly to daily energy consumption, the ultimate stability of paper money rests entirely on the fiscal discipline of the nation issuing it. Inside the United States Treasury, this shift creates an existential dilemma. With the American national debt crossing $34 trillion and annual interest costs topping $1 trillion, the loss of reliable foreign buyers for government bonds threatens to trigger a profound structural crisis. If international energy markets stop absorbing hundreds of billions of new American debt paper each year, domestic borrowing costs will inevitably rise, leaving federal policymakers with the agonizing choice between massive austerity or hyperinflationary debt monetization. The quiet of the trading floor in Riyadh today reflects this new reality. High-frequency digital displays flash real-time prices for crude oil, natural gas, and refined fuels. But the financial wiring beneath those screens looks fundamentally different than it did during the oil shocks of the 1970s. Fiber optic cables transmit payment instructions through domestic central bank networks that bypass traditional American clearing systems entirely. In port cities along the Persian Gulf, tanker ships load millions of barrels of crude under new commercial contracts where energy is valued against mixed baskets of foreign currencies and precious metals. The physical commodity flows across the ocean just as it always has, but the invisible web of debt that once tied every single barrel to Washington policy has frayed beyond repair. The human cost of this multi-decade monetary construct falls most heavily on ordinary citizens living in developing nations. For decades, small countries were forced to sacrifice their local agricultural and manufacturing output simply to earn the foreign dollars required to keep their domestic power grids running and their transport networks fueled. When global dollar liquidity dried up or interest rates spiked in Washington, entire national economies crumbled overnight, leaving working families to bear the burden of soaring food prices and collapsed local currencies. Even within the United States, millions of manufacturing workers paid a silent toll for their country's monetary dominance. By maintaining an artificially overvalued dollar to support its global reserve status, American industrial exports were made permanently uncompetitive on the world stage, shuttering factories across the Midwest while financial firms on Wall Street amassed unprecedented wealth and influence. This complex history reveals how a covert 3-minute phone call in 1974 shaped the daily economic lives of billions of people for 50 years. The secret deal struck between Washington and the House of Saud transformed the dollar from a simple unit of account into an inescapable toll gate for global survival, enabling one nation to run unlimited trade deficits while exporting its inflation to the rest of the planet. That era of unchallengeable leverage is now drawing to a close, not through a sudden military defeat, but through the slow, arithmetic accumulation of alternative commercial paths. As energy trade decouples from a single fiat currency, the global economy is fracturing into regional currency blocks, ending the unipolar monetary framework that defined the late 20th century. Yet one crucial question remains unresolved in the official archives and public records. Can an economic superpower whose entire domestic model relies on cheap foreign capital successfully transition back to a balanced trade reality without triggering catastrophic inflation or a collapse of its social safety nets? History offers no simple blueprint for a global reserve currency stepping down from its throne without a major financial convulsion. The delicate balance between political influence, energy consumption, and sovereign debt that Henry Kissinger stitched together in 1974 operated as a masterwork of monetary engineering, but it was always borrowing stability from a future that has finally arrived. As nations continue to forge new trade routes and settle debts on their own terms, the 5-decade experiment of backing paper money with energy comes full circle. The math that once built an imperial monetary system has turned inward, leaving a changing world to reckon with the profound price of unearned leverage. This long pivot away from single currency dependence reshapes modern central banking on a structural level. Regulatory guidelines established across international financial capitals now explicitly encourage central banks to diversify their reserves, codifying a permanent institutional shift in how global wealth is stored, protected, and deployed across international borders. On factory floors across former industrial manufacturing hubs, working families experienced the quiet erosion of domestic employment. As capital flowed continuously into federal debt instruments rather than local industrial production, entire industrial communities lost the commercial foundation that had reliably sustained multiple generations of workers and local businesses. In energy-importing developing nations, the human cost appeared even more directly in daily life. Small family enterprises faced constant local currency devaluation whenever crude prices spiked, forcing long-standing shops to shut their doors as fuel and electricity bills rapidly outpaced local household earnings. The structural reality underlying this economic strain was straightforward. When basic energy settlement requires a specific foreign paper currency, sovereign nations are forced to export tangible physical commodities or accept expensive dollar-denominated loans simply to keep their municipal power grids operational and transport networks moving. This economic design created a continuous global suction pump, pulling physical resources from developing economies while returning paper treasury obligations issued in Washington. It transformed energy trade from a simple commercial swap into a structural mechanism that anchored global debt markets for half a century. Diplomatic historians and economic analysts continue to debate whether the principal negotiators of 1974 truly grasped the full longevity of what they created. Was the arrangement intended merely as an emergency stabilization measure for an inflation crisis, or was it a calculated, permanent financial architecture designed to secure monetary advantage? Declassified cables show immediate political concerns, yet the ultimate outcome was a self-sustaining system of international debt that future administrations could not dismantle. The lingering weight of that strategic choice remains visible today in every Ministry of Finance attempting to balance national debt against economic sovereignty. As non-dollar clearing systems expand, Formal bilateral trade agreements negotiated in Beijing, Riyadh, and New Delhi are locking in alternative settlement networks. The institutional exclusivity that preserved dollar dominance in energy markets for 5 decades is gradually giving way to a multipolar trading landscape. This institutional realignment forces national central banks to hold larger physical gold reserves and sovereign debt in diverse currencies. The automatic global demand for treasury paper that once funded unchecked federal deficits is steadily narrowing into a far more competitive and demanding global market. When these macroeconomic structures shift, everyday families experience the consequences through persistent changes in purchasing power. Higher borrowing costs for sovereign debt inevitably trickle down into local credit markets, reduced municipal spending, and sustained price pressures on essential everyday goods. The connection between global capital recycling and consumer budgets becomes apparent whenever international debt markets experience stress. Every policy decision made in financial capitals reflects the ongoing tension between maintaining a dominant reserve currency and managing the domestic realities of trade deficits and accumulated national debt. Inside the polished corridors of the Treasury Department and the quiet trading floors of Wall Street, digital monitors track the steady pulse of global capital flows. The physical architecture of international banking stands unchanged, even as the financial rules governing global commerce undergo their most significant transformation in decades. Across the desert expanse of Saudi Arabia, massive solar arrays and expanded port facilities now stand alongside historic petroleum complexes. The physical landscape reflects a kingdom preparing for an economic future where energy takes many forms and international trade is settled across multiple currency networks. In a quiet archive in Riyadh, the original documents of the 1974 agreement remain preserved, a silent testament to the pivotal moment when paper debt was bound to crude oil, reshaping global power for 50 years.